.NET 6 eliminated the Startup.cs file from all web projects. It reworked how projects are built, and it eliminated the class and namespace entries in the Program.cs file. Basically, everything you knew about how to set up a web project in .NET seems to have changed. Or has it? In this video, we will look at what has changed and where it's changed, as well as how to adjust going forward. We will see where all the settings are now located and how to adjust them. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. I do that by providing videos here on YouTube multiple times per week. Plus, I have a weekly podcast. I also provide courses on C#, web development, and much more on IamTimCorey.com. The profits from those sales are what pays for the free content here on YouTube, so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. In this video, as with most of my videos, I'm going to create some source code. If you'd like a copy of the source code, use the link in the description. Okay, let's get started in Visual Studio. Here I have Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition, and we're going to create a new project. So this new project, let's start with a Blazor Server application. We'll add a few different types. We'll do Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and even MVC, just so you can see all of those different types and make sure we understand how the startup changes for each of those. So let's hit next. And for this, we're going to call this the Blazor Net 5 for .NET 5 version. And we'll give the solution name of changes to startup. That's our solution name. That way, when you look at this, you'll see a number of different projects. We're not going to change much source code today. We're just going to look at the source code. But I want you to have this just in case you want it. Okay, we'll hit next. And this is the Net 5 version. So .NET 5, which is marked as current. It's not actually current anymore. It is really the long-term support is the latest version. They say current, but I believe that's going to be no longer supported in just a little while. So .NET 6 is the way to go. From now on, we want to stay on the latest version. However, .NET 5 was the last version that used both Program.cs and Startup.cs in web projects. So we're going to use that as our comparison point because it's the one closest to the major change, which is .NET 6. So .NET 5 will leave everything else standard and hit create. Once that creates, we'll do it again. So let's close this back out. I will pin this so you can see it once it allows me to. There we go. And I'm going to right click on solution and say add new project, Blazor Server app again. We're going to call this Blazor Net 6. And I realize now that I called it Blazor Net 5 and Net 6 when this is Blazor Server. So we'll say WASM for WebAssembly, just so you know the difference. We hit next, and we're going to make sure we choose .NET 6, the long-term support, and hit create. Okay, so there's our Net 5 and Net 6 for Blazor Server. Let's keep adding for right now. We'll add a new project, Blazor WebAssembly. We'll call this WASM Net 5. And again, we'll choose Net 5. We'll create. And we'll do the same thing again and say WASM Net 6. And WASM, by the way, is the industry standard acronym for WebAssembly. So that's why I call it that. Okay, this is Net 6. And if you're following along, just make sure you get the Net 6 and Net 5 correct, the name and the project type. Otherwise, you'll be confused. We're going to add a couple more. We're going to add an MVC controller as well, model view controller. And we'll say MVC Net 5. And this is Net 5. Notice that it enables the Razor runtime compilation. It's something you can do in Net 5, but not Net 6. But we're going to leave it unchecked. There is, let's close all of these. There's net 5, and we're going to add one more, and that is MVC net 6. So that should be the last of them. Okay, so now we have all of our different versions. Let's start looking at what's going on here. Let's start with our Blazor server. So Blazor server, we're going to focus in on the startup process, not the entire application. So the startup process is in two files, Program.cs and startup. Now let's do this. Let's go to net 6 and open up the only file that's involved in startup, which is Program.cs. There is no Startup.cs. Now let's split this off. Let's do this in a new horizontal group. So now down here is net 6 down below, and up top is net 5. And that way you can kind of compare and contrast right where they're at. And let's start with comparing the Program.cs files. First of all, you'll see that we have a lot of using statements at the top. We have less here. We still have some, but we have less. So there is a concerted effort to eliminate the need to have repeated using statements, and that's where we put them into a global.cs. We also have implicit usings. I've covered both of those topics in other videos on this channel, but just note that's what's going on here, why we have more on one than on the other. But then coming down here, we have our namespace and our class, and then we have our static void main. We have none of those things here. This is the namespace, the class, and the method are all implied down here. So technically, this is in the main method, all this code, down in .NET 6, whereas in .NET 5, you have to specify that it's the main method. Also note that we have to bring in, for .NET 6, we have to bring in the root namespace, so Blazor net 6. We have to bring that in if we wanted to access other things on the root of a namespace, because really we don't have a namespace for our static void main, which is what the implicit is. So just note that's a little quirk there. Okay, so inside of static void main, we have this create host builder, which brings in the args that come from the command line when you execute the application. And then we say build and run. So create host builder, build, and run. Now notice that create host builder is actually a method right down here, which says host.create default builder, bring in those same args, then configure web host defaults, and then use startup, and that's where it brings in this other startup file. So what do we have down here that's equivalent? Well, we have instead of host.create default builder, we have web application.create builder. And this does a lot more stuff that's a lot more web focused than the host.create default builder did. But it's the same kind of stuff. The end result is pretty much the same. But notice that we stop with this create builder. We don't do the build and run yet. But if we come down here, remember, we're in builder right now. Well, then we say builder.build after this section. We'll get back to this section in a minute. So builder.build is right here. We assign that to the app variable. Then at the very bottom, we have app.run. So this first line right here, create builder with the args, is the same as this right here, or similar to. Yes, they have changed from host to web application, and they've done a few different things, and they've renamed it from create default builder to just create builder. But it's pretty close to the same. We'll get back to this in just a minute. But then that's calling this method right here. So we call that method, and then we say build and run, and we've spaced that out here on line 12 and line 31. And there's some great benefits to doing this. So it's the same stuff or similar stuff, but it's now in one file with everything else. So we still have everything in here, except you might say, well, we don't have that, but it's using startup. What's that doing? Well, it's bringing the startup class to do some configuration. We don't need to do that because we're doing the configuration right in line. So that's why we don't need this. So all of this code is in .NET 6 Program.cs. Let's look at startup. Startup, again, lots of using statements. In fact, we have 12 of them. But then inside of startup, we have, okay, give me the configuration. Don't need that because we already have the configuration. We'll talk about that in a minute. So then down here we have configure services, where we say services.add razor pages, services.add server side Blazor, and then the add singleton for weather forecast service. That's the default startup stuff that's like a boilerplate demo. Well, down here we have builder.services.add razor pages, builder.services.add server side Blazor, and builder.services.add singleton for that same weather forecast service. So where we configure services is in the configure services method in Startup.cs in .NET 5. We now do it after we configure or create the builder before we build the application. That's where we configure our services in this file. It's the same thing. The only difference is you can't just copy and paste from here down to here, because notice this is services, which is actually a parameter name, where down here we say builder.services. So that would be the change there. So that's the only change, though. You can just say builder.services instead of services from here. It's the same thing. Now, we also have configure. This is where we configure our web application to say, hey, if you're in development, use the development or developer exception page. Otherwise, use the error page and HSTS. Well, after the build down here, we can see if we're not. That's why I don't really like the bang character used there, because it's hard to see that. It kind of reads like if you're in development mode, but no. If you're not in development mode, then use the error page and HSTS, which is the same as up here. Because if you're in development, which means if you're not in development, it uses that, which means that they kind of eliminated the need for this because that's the default. So we don't need to have both sides of that option. We can just say, hey, if you're not in development mode, use this exception handler. Now, next up, we have use HTTPS redirection, use static files, use routing. We have use HTTPS redirection, use static files, use routing. Okay, so same stuff. And then we have up here two endpoints. We map the Blazor hub, which is the signal R connection, and a fallback to the _host file. Well, we have Blazor hub and map the fallback to the _host file. The only difference is we don't have to wrap it in app.use endpoints. Instead, we can just do it right on the app file because it knows it's a web application, so it knows it needs endpoints. So that's another benefit of up here, the web application.create builder, as opposed to over here where we say host.create default builder. So there's a benefit there, again, kind of shrinking the need. So at the end of our mapping, up here in 5, we're done, which comes back to, okay, build and run. Well, down here, we just say run. So it's all there. It's the same stuff. It's just that in .NET 6, we have it all in one file. There are some benefits here too, because of the fact that in .NET 5, notice we're passing in the, in Startup, we're passing in the configuration. Let's go here. We're passing in the configuration in order to get access to it, in order to use it if we need to. And that's for talking to app settings.json and so forth. Well, we don't have to do that here because we have access to the builder and we can work with the configuration right in line. We have to pass it different methods or different classes. So also, you might say, well, Tim, my logger has some configuration I have to do, and I used to do that by going to Program.cs and doing something in here in the create host or create default builder and then overriding things. Well, no problem. You can still do that because right in here, you can say builder dot, let's say a logging, and then do anything you want with logging. Or maybe you want to change some of the configuration where it reads from which JSON file it reads from, or only reading from app settings.json as opposed to all the different places it loads. No problem. Configuration. There's where we can mess with configuration, change it, add it, modify it, and so on. So it's all still there. It's just all in Program.cs as opposed to two files. Now, let's keep going because there are other systems. So let's open up first. Let's go to WASM, so WebAssembly. I'll open up Program.cs, and I'll open down here. We can close this out. Sure, save it. Why not? And then up here, let's open up the .NET 5 version. So we have WebAssembly.NET 5. We'll open up the Program.cs. So Program.cs for .NET 5 is all we have for WebAssembly. We don't have a Startup.cs. So really we're comparing what seems like apples to apples, where we have, a whole bunch of using statements, whereas we don't here, we only have 3. But then down here we have our namespace and class and method, which is main. We don't need any of that. So we start really on line 17. Pretty impressive, right? We're starting on line 17 and we're already 3 indents in, whereas down here we're starting on line 5, no indents in. And it's builder equals WebAssembly host builder dot create default. This is WebAssembly host builder dot create default. Same thing. Up here we have our root components. We add the app, which is #app. Same thing down here. We do add one new one, but this isn't really about the change from one layout type to another or change in that way. It is a .NET 6 change, but it's an addition to how Blazor works. And that is we add the ability to write to the header. So that's what that extra thing is for. But then we get right to the add scoped for HTTP client. And that's the exact same thing we're doing right here. Same code. And then down here, we have the await builder.build.run async. Same exact thing. So we haven't really changed anything in our Blazor WebAssembly from .NET 5 to .NET 6 as far as how it runs or where the code is. It's just that we took out what really seems to be unnecessary indentations and ceremony. So namespace, class, method. We don't need any of those things. We took them all out. That also means we lost or didn't need 3 indentation levels. And even though we added 1 line of code, we're done at line 11 as opposed to line 25. So it just kind of cleans things up, but the same code is there. Okay, so let's look at finally MVC. So let's go to MVC in .NET 6 and we'll open up our Program.cs. Again, that's the only file you get in MVC as opposed to for .NET 5, you get both Program.cs and Startup. So let's make sure you close the WASM Program.cs so we don't get confused. We'll start with comparing the two Program.cs's. Again, with .NET 6, the bottom, we can see that we don't need the class, the namespace, or the method name. We're in static void main, but it's just kind of implied. Up here, we have to get through line 14, actually to line 16 before you have our first line of code, which is that create host builder, build and run. It looks just like Blazor Server did. Same kind of thing. Well, again, we are saying web application.create builder. This is the foundation now for all web applications, which is important to note. I want you to think this through. Because every web application starts with the same core framework, which means that even though it's a Blazor Server application or an MVC application or Razor Pages or API, they all start from the same base, which means they all have access to the same stuff. It's all an ASP.NET Core web application. So it doesn't matter which one you're using, you still have access to the same stuff. Now there is a little bit of a asterisk there, and that is the Blazor WebAssembly. And the reason for that is because while it is the same base, it is a different system because it's designed to run fully on the client. So it doesn't have access to certain things like accessing the configuration and like the app settings.json. It doesn't have access to write to the database and other things that we just take for granted in normal C# applications because of the fact it doesn't run on the server. So there's a little bit of an asterisk there, but for the most part, for our ASP.NET Core web applications, they are the same underneath the hood. So just want to point that out. So our Program.cs file, the only thing we need to know about this is it's really this line right here, although we do have, again, that build and then on line 27 run. So those things still do exist. Okay, so let's go to Startup.cs and see what the differences are here. We bring our configuration in, and then we have this configure services. Again, this is where dependency injection gets configured. Well, in .NET 6, we just say builder.services before we run the build command. So builder.services.add controllers with views. Services.add controllers with views. It's the same call, it's just in a different place. So then we have the configure, which again, we have the is development, use developer exception page, otherwise use the home error and HSTS. Well, if you're not in development, okay, remember, don't miss that exclamation point, then use the exception handler, which is home/error, same as above here, and HSTS. So the only change there is we're defaulting to use developer exception page, and we're turning that off if you're not in development. So up here, we specify both ways, both development and not development. Down here, we're just specifying the not development. And then afterwards, we have our standard HTTPS redirection, static files, routing, and authorization. Down here, the same 4 calls. It's the same things. Okay? Then we have our endpoints, where we map a controller route, which is the default route, which you have your controller equals home, action equals index, and your optional ID. And by the way, quick aside here, if you're ever wondering in MVC, how do you get the defaults? Like, why is home default and why is the index action the default action? Well, that's because of this pattern right here. You can actually change that if you wanted to. I would recommend against it, but you could. So down here in .NET 6, it's the same thing. Map controller route. So name is default, and the same pattern is applied. So the only difference is it's not wrapped inside the use endpoints. And then you run. That's it. So the code is the same or practically the same. So there's a little bit of difference here in the map route. We're not wrapping here. And also if we come up here to the services, we have services.add controllers of views, where we say up here builder.services.add controller of views. But besides that, it's the same stuff. It just mixed the Program.cs file with the Startup.cs file into one file. We can still break these out if we wanted to. And I do, because usually my dependency injection, which is line 4 down here, that tends to grow as your application grows with it. As you add dependencies, which all applications have dependencies of some kind, well, then that's going to grow. And so I usually move that off into its own class file and call it from here. But that's up to you when you think it's necessary for growing your application. But it's all right here for now in Program.cs. And anything you need to do that you used to do in .NET 5, you can still do in .NET 6. It just means that you do it in Program.cs instead of in maybe Startup.cs, maybe Program.cs. You do it now all in this one file. So if you need, again, you need to configure logging, it's on Builder. You need to configure the configuration, it's on Builder. If you need to change how your routing works, it's on App. So you can just follow this pattern and tweak is all it's going to be. Tweak your code to work with this new format as opposed to what you have been doing in .NET 5 and before. So if you see a .NET Core 3.1 application and say, oh man, it's totally different, don't worry, it's not. There'll be some tweaks, but for the most part, it's just copy and paste into the new Program.cs format, and it will work the same way it worked in .NET Core 3.1 or .NET 5. Okay? So if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. So leave them down in the comments below. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.